a memoir, is my story of survival of the Bosnian Genocide. I will read from this book for you. But before we get there, I would like to share a couple of slides. I know I had some technical difficulties, and for some reason, if slides do not work out, we'll just revert back to conversation. But I thought it would be interesting to share, if I can, a few visuals for you and just give you a sense of background of why this really recent genocide occurred in my country. So as I already mentioned, I'm a professor at Columbia University at Teachers College. Education is my passion, my love. One of the reasons that I managed to survive the genocide is that I was constantly inspired to learn, even under a complete siege in my hometown of Bihac. Just a brief background for those of you who might not be familiar with the region or the rationale for why this genocide began. I was 16 in 1992 when Serbia, which was one of the republics in former Yugoslavia, decided to invade Bosnia and Herzegovina. They were helped by Bosnian Serbs, but it was really Serbia that initiated invasion, aggression towards Bosnia, and began the genocide against Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks. Bosniaks is not the term that's broadly known, but in Bosnia, Bosniaks have, as an ethnic group, existed for centuries, and generally, globally, we refer to Bosniaks as Bosnian Muslims. Why did this happen? It simply happened because this narrative of hatred emerged amongst the political and intellectual leadership in former Yugoslavia at that time, particularly amongst intellectual, political, academic leadership in Serbia. You might be familiar with names like Slobodan Milosevic, who was tried for genocide and many accounts of genocide in former Yugoslavia, Radovan Karadzic as well, who was a Bosnian Serb leader. So those are the leading voices that really established this idea that Serbs are this ethnic, racial group that is superior relative to everyone else who lived in that region who is non-Serb. And in Bosnia in particular, we were a diverse state or a diverse country. Majority of Bosnians were Bosnian Muslims, but we also have significant ethnic group of Bosnian Croats, as well as a small Jewish population. And so this narrative that emerged in Serbia was really dehumanizing all these other groups as sort of groups that should not be existing in the region. And over time, over a period of relatively short few years, Serbia's primary goal became turning Yugoslavia into what they called Greater Serbia. And Greater Serbia simply meant eliminating everybody else and creating this territorially larger country that would be for Serbs only. That obviously meant killing everyone else who was non-Serb. In Bosnia, majority of population were Bosnian Muslims. So that included, that vision of Greater Serbia included eliminating someone like me, a 16-year-old girl who loved volleyball, science, math, who wrote poetry, who didn't believe that this politics could really become my reality, that this kind of visceral hatred could be realized on the ground. And so in 1992, in fear of Serbia and this narrative, Bosnia, along with Croatia and Slovenia, all proclaimed independence and said, Serbia, we do not want to be part of that Yugoslavia that you are envisioning for yourself. Serbia reacted and immediately invaded Bosnia. Serbia invaded Slovenia, Croatia, and then Bosnia. Why you're most familiar with Bosnia is likely because the genocide in Bosnia was truly gruesome. How was this possible? It was possible because Serbia controlled the entire military of former Yugoslavia. 90 to 98% of officers in the Yugoslav National Army were Serbs. So a large number of them sided with this idea that, yes, these other groups should be ethnically cleansed and eliminated. I would, however, highlight a notable individual, Jovan Divjak, who was a Serb general in Yugoslav National Army, who passed on only days ago, who said, I can't partake in this genocide of Bosnian Muslims. And in fact, he became one of the first leaders of our self-organized army, or attempt to defend ourselves against the formidable executor that the Yugoslav National Army was. Just to give you a snapshot of the region geographically, you can see on your right, as you're looking at the screen, this is Serbia, and Serbia essentially invaded triangle that you are seeing in the middle is Bosnia. You can see two green kind of areas that represent areas where Bosnian Muslim population was really pushed into, and we were besieged. We were constantly bombed and killed and starved and cut off from the rest of the world, with the intent to prevent the world from finding out the kinds of violence and mass killings and rapes that were taking place against Bosnian Muslims. And I lived and grew up, and the entire story presented in the book, The Cat I Never Named, captures my experience of surviving in my hometown of Bihac, which is in this northern western part of the country that actually bordered another occupied part in Croatia, also controlled by Serbs. So you can see this sort of big red area, and think of it as an area that was really captured very quickly as the genocide began by the Serb army, because they controlled the weapons, they controlled the army, and what once upon a time used to be Yugoslav National Army. And so the rest of the population was fairly quickly persecuted and executed, except in these two areas from where most Bosnian Muslims survived. Today, I am a professor at Columbia University, as I mentioned, and my work and my life is really dedicated to studying mechanisms and factors that lead societies and countries to fall apart. I study social transformations, social disintegrations, and particularly the role of narratives and education in those efforts. To give you an example of the work that I just did this semester with my students here at Columbia, in response to the rise in all forms of racism in this country, from anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism. I've worked with my students and the Department of Homeland Security, particularly the Office for Prevention of Targeted Violence, to create the first ever curriculum, online training for teachers in America to really build their own resilience to hate and transfer those skills and tools into the classrooms. And so we're actually in the process right now of offering that to educators around the country that can access this curriculum for free. And these are just some of the organizations that I had worked for all over the world on very similar issues, just in different contexts. And that brings me to the book that we'll talk about today, The Cat I Never Named. It is a book that is a crossover between young adult audience and adult audience. Young adult audience because I really wanted to make sure it's accessible to young people, and young people are reminded, to answer Sam's question from early on, that young people are reminded that genocide happens today, and that there are people living in the United States of America today who have survived gruesome kinds of violence elsewhere. The book has won various awards in the United States, wonderful reviews, and I am humbled by it. But to me, this is not only a book, this is really an educational tool through which I hope to raise awareness of genocide. I wanted to let you know that there are also beautiful things that happen in the story in the cat I never named, and this is just a photograph of my city of Bihac. It is known for a beautiful river, actually named by Romans as Una, or one and only. And you'll read in the book, and I'll read from the book, a segment that depicts my life during the genocide in what we called my city Bihać pocket. I survived 1,200 days under the Serbs' military siege. And the best way to describe those days is that on a good day, a friend of a friend was blown up, and on a bad day, it was a family member or a friend that died, that was killed. Um, to give you some visuals to go with the book, when and if you decide to read it, these are some of the characters in the story. In the upper left corner is my uncle, who is a character in the book. In the middle, you see my parents. They are some of the main characters. My father, who is no longer with us, who's smiling in the middle, and my mother looking at him to the left. And in the far right corner, you see me extremely happy and teasing my brother during one of my arrivals to Bosnia at the airport. So this is my younger brother who survived genocide with me, along with my mom. And then at the bottom, you see my home in Bosnia, which we rebuilt after the war. A portion of it was destroyed. It is something that I write about in the book, and it is a site of a number of scenes in the story. And this is a photograph of me after the war, just to give you a sense of destruction that was taken in Sarajevo. And these are just some of the sites that I decided to share with you in case you would like to learn more about my part of Bosnia and what happened during the war. And I would like to now share with you a segment from the book that captures a moment when I find myself, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see your faces. This is a moment in the story where I find myself crossing the main bridge in my city. So I learned months into the genocide that the school would be back in session. School was ended with the beginning of genocide, and we learn that school will be back in session, and I'm extremely excited. And I decide, as teens often do, to hide from my parents, that I will leave my house and go tell a friend of mine in another part of the city that the school will be on. I was a nerd. I was a math and physics nerd. And so I was very excited that we would be back in classrooms. And in that moment, in that scene, I am crossing a bridge, and something happens that changes my life forever. Then I hear a whistling overhead, a thin, reedy sound. An instant later, I see a flash as a missile hits a house on the bank of the Una, on my home side of the bridge. The sound of the explosion comes an instant later, and I stand frozen. Bizarrely thinking about physics, about the relative speed of light and sound that cleaves the experience in two. First, the sight of fire and flame, then disconnected by a second or two, sound waves that roll over me like messengers eager to bear bad news. I hear another missile overhead, launched from the mountains surrounding our town. Someone told Tata, who told me in turn, the bomb that you hear is not the one with your name on it. If you hear it whistle, it is because it's flying over your head to somewhere else. You never hear a whisper from the bomb that kills you. The air raid siren starts its high-pitched howl then. We have no radar. Nothing to tell us that missiles are inbound, so the siren is a joke. It just serves to remind us that people are being killed. It gives no warning, just wails and mourns with the rest of us. Davor and I find each other again. We're still frozen in place, not knowing if we're about to die. But our eyes meet across the bridge. Between us, I see the mother and her little boy, the girl in the green sweater, a trio of middle aged women who look like sisters. Davor takes a step toward me. Then the air seems to be sucked out of the world as I'm hit with an earth shattering, deafening explosion. There's a flash between Davor and me, and I'm blinded. Metal and stone are flying around me. I turn to run, and it's only when my legs are moving that I realize I'm not dead. I only make it a few steps before I fall, scraping my knees. In the dust and chaos, I hear screams, and I drag myself to my feet, stunned. My ears are ringing, and the air is choked with dust. I smell smoke. I taste smoke. There's grit on my tongue. The blue bridge is still standing. The bomb struck a glancing blow that didn't do anything much to the structure, but the pedestrians on the bridge. Against every survival instinct, I make myself walk backward toward the other end of the bridge. I look all around, but don't see Davor. The little boy, the one who wanted to look at fish over the side of the bridge, is standing in the middle of a cloud of masonry dust. His mouth is open, and at first I think the sound he's making is part of the loud ringing in my ears, because everything sounds weirdly muffled at first. The sounds are returning to my ears one at a time. Then I realize he's screaming, a long, drawn out, terrible cry that stops only when he's out of breath, then starts again after a ragged gasp. I go to him. He's blonde, tussle-haired, and blue-eyed, just like Dino when he was younger. But his little face looks impossibly old. I wish he could be confused. I wish he didn't know exactly what just happened. But this little boy understands his loss, and he's suffused with helpless, inarticulate rage. I go to him, reaching out my hand. He just stares at me with his prematurely aged face. I look beyond him. Blood on a stylish suit, the fox fur collar, made from a whole fox, its sharp white teeth grinning as it grasps its own tail. Its black glass eyes are staring at me. Above that, nothing. There's nothing where his mother's head should be. He finds words now, and his screams turn into a desperate wail for his mother. He's not looking at her, but he must have seen. He's calling to her like his words could turn back time, undo the bomb. Like if he begs the universe loudly enough, he can make his mother alive again. I take his hand, and he looks at me like I'm an alien thing. I try to lead him off the bridge, but he's like a boulder, immovable. All this time, he never stops screaming his feral fury against the world. An old man staggers beside us. A couple clings to each other as they walk through the smoke. Though it's midday, the smoke and dust make it look like a foggy evening. Survivors are like ghosts in the haze. I still don't see Davor, not among the bodies or the survivors. The little boy's grief shatters me. There's nothing I can do. So I leave him. It's a wrenching decision, but someone will come to help him. I look at the other people on the bridge. The three middle-aged sisters are strewn about like old clothes. That's what I see. Their old lady sweaters and their sensible shoes. A man is hanging half of the bridge, draped over the rail. Blood is dripping in a puddle at his feet. Then I see the girl in the green sweater like mine. She's on the ground, curled on her side, facing away from me. Her sweater is perfectly clean and tidy, like she just decided to take a nap in this odd place. I think she's unconscious. Maybe she was knocked out by the shock wave. I kneel at her side and take her shoulder, gently turning her over as I say, "Don't worry, I'm here. I'll help you." I roll her and find a bloody horror. The front of her body is stripped of clothes, stripped of skin, shredded from a hail of metal and stone shrapnel. From the front, she doesn't look human. She looks like meat. I scream and scramble backward on my hands and feet like a crab, wiping my bloody hands on the ground. They make a red paste with the dust. I roll to my knees, haul myself to my feet, look around for somebody, anybody who can do something. Suddenly, there are lights up ahead in the middle of the road where we're walking. It's a big square white lorry with tall blue letters on the side. UN. The United Nations is supposed to be here to help the suffering, to facilitate peace. With a gasp of relief, I run to meet the truck, waving my hand to stop them. "Help is here," I shout to the little boy as I pass him. "These men will help you." I'm standing in the middle of the road, right in the truck's path. It slows. The driver sees me. He meets my eye. Please have medics, I think. Please have some kind counselor who can take care of this poor child. Please have someone to compassionately tend to that poor girl's body to cover her ravaged face. But the UN truck swerves around me, increasing speed. Okay, I think. They're going to the wounded in the center of the bridge. But the truck doesn't stop. It drives fast enough to make the damaged bridge shake. It swerves carefully around the carnage and rubble and carries on as if dead Bosnians weren't sprawled on the streets. The world is watching, and it doesn't care. Thank you. I have to say, I've done about 150 conversations like this in about 30 countries, and it doesn't get easier for me to read this. So thank you for listening, and with that, I open it to your questions or Sam's questions.
All right, well, thank you for that. Everyone, if you do have questions, if you can send it through chat, a few have come through, but just find my name if you would, Sam, and next to it is HMCEC, and shoot me the question, and I will try and organize. I've been trying to organize them as we go along. One of the questions actually that does come up, you certainly touched on it here, but is how you would evaluate the United Nations in terms of its peacekeeping mission, its kind of paramilitary efforts.
I think they were cosmetic in the context of Bosnia. I think we tend to feel guilty about allowing genocides to happen. And we tend to cosmetically try to create this presence of the international community or relevance of the international community in those kinds of circumstances. But on the ground, in reality, genocide occurred uninterrupted. Just as an example, and there are a number of scenes that I depict that relate to my interactions and my friends' interactions with the UN soldiers or peacekeepers that were in Bihac, as they were in Sarajevo during the war. There were 6 what were called or proclaimed safe areas in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And those 6 towns were really places where Muslim population was besieged and was being killed daily. And so the impression from the outside for someone like you watching on the news what might have been occurring in Bosnia at that time might have been that, oh, there are 6 places where civilians are safe, and that couldn't be further from the truth. The UN soldiers were there. They were watching us get killed, get bombed. In many cases, as you know, in Srebrenica, particularly, as you might know, in Srebrenica, which is one of the cities where the UN soldiers allowed Serb army to essentially walk into the city and execute every boy, every man, and engage in full-blown execution of the local population. And the UN watched it happen. In fact, in addition to my book, at this moment, you can also watch one of the movies titled Quo Vadis Aida. I'll put it in a second in a chat. It's a movie that captures the story of what happened in Bosnia. It is nominated for the Oscars, and fingers crossed, I think it should get an Oscar for the best foreign movie next, I believe this coming Sunday. And my hope is that with efforts like that, with efforts like The Cat I Never Named, Sam, and with the efforts that you do to educate people about genocide, that we can raise awareness and I hope stop further violence that is happening even today around the world.
All right, so someone was wondering, just as background, what is, it seems like there's been a long historic rift, Serbians, Croats, Bosnians, Muslims. Is it based simply on the 3 different religions, the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Islam, or is it ethnic? Is it cultural? Is it the whole thing?
You know, I think in the United States we have a tendency to view ourselves as exceptional, that we're somehow different than the rest of the world, and that this kind of hatred and tension between different groups, whether ethnic, racial, or religious, only exists elsewhere. But I think if we look at the history of the United States, if we look at the history of what happened to Native Americans, I think it becomes clear that genocide occurred here. And I think part of genocide, as you know, is also denial of genocide. And I think even in this country, we haven't grappled with the history of those kinds of tensions, and not to talk about racial segregation and the continued killings and targeting of certain racial groups. And so I tend to say that hatred is not exclusive to any one group of people, any one individual. We're all capable of it, and only through education we can raise awareness that we could all succumb to the forces of hatred, and that the education is the only way to really preclude it from happening. And so what happened in former Yugoslavia, you know, I grew up being a Muslim kid who knew I was being discriminated against. So to simplify the story in the equivalent terms in the United States, while we didn't have a skin colors differentiation, I was in Yugoslavia a minority. We were not allowed to say we were Bosniaks. That was illegal. We were only recognized as Muslims. Our ethnic group was not allowed anywhere in any documentation, in any kind of acknowledgement. And part of that was the intent to really take that identity away from local Bosniaks who have lived there for 600 years. And I grew up in an educational system where I never once read a story that had a Muslim character in it. I was a math nerd who never once solved a math problem that had a Muslim child's name in it. And but I never expected that eventually genocide would occur. So I think this idea of genocide and elimination of Bosnian Muslims in particular was present throughout history, and I won't go into details historically. And so the latest genocide, if you will, is just one of many strategies or mechanisms or attempts that go through history that were made to eliminate Bosnian Muslims on the premise that we don't belong to white Christian Europe, that we are some form of ethnic impurity in Europe. And I think that narrative, being that you are, as an institution, are raising awareness of the Holocaust, I think that narrative very much resembles what Nazis and fascists promoted during World War II, that is familiar to many Jews. And in fact, it was the relationship between Jewish and Muslim community in Bosnia that led to my own saving, if you will, and coming to the United States. And I'm happy to talk about that in more detail if others have questions on that.
That's so that narrative you talk about, and if you look at your bio, the parallels are, as you said, very, very obvious between what your experience and some of our survivors here. Do you think that it's a good teaching tool to use those parallels to compare and contrast two genocides, for example, or more? Or should it be an exclusive study of the Holocaust or the Bosnian Genocide?
I think it's important to establish the facts in terms of independent study of each genocide or each atrocity that occurs. But what I believe is even more important, and that is that we need to use that information and that history to point out to shared humanity, or point out to hatred that is really identical, and the narratives of whether it's white supremacy, neo-Nazi narrative of having to eliminate Jews, or Milosevic's narrative of having to eliminate Muslims. Those narratives really are mirror images of each other. And just to give you one hope and one relationship that is not talked about enough, and that I would love to, in raising awareness about genocide, also raise awareness of those who stand up against it, who speak out against it, who fight against it, is, as an example, in Bosnia, we have Sarajevo Haggadah. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it. Sarajevo Haggadah is deemed to be one of the most valuable books in the world today. It's estimated in millions of dollars. It traveled to Bosnia when Jews were persecuted from Spain, and it was saved by Bosnian Muslims. So during World War II, Sarajevo Haggadah was protected by in a local village by a local imam, so equivalent for Jews to rabbi. So imam is Muslim priest, who hid it in a mosque because German Nazi soldiers did not expect that Muslims would be saving Jewish cultural treasure. And that's how it survived World War II. And if you fast forward to the genocide against Bosnian Muslims, when we were being executed and killed, Serb army also bombed the museum in Sarajevo where Sarajevo Haggadah was kept. And during one of the bombings, one of the local police officers, who was again Bosnian Muslim, took the book, hid it. It was simply on the floor of the museum, about to be destroyed and burnt. And he took it and was kept underground. So Bosnian Muslims made sure that they kept Jewish Haggadah kept underground throughout the entire war so that it could be preserved from destruction. That's a story. In fact, I'm going to be working on a chapter for a book for Jewish Center at Indiana University that will highlight those kinds of positive relationships where people saw the connection between Holocaust and what was happening to us as Bosnian Muslims in Bosnia in 1990s.
Interesting, very interesting. What are your thoughts about reparations, maybe applied to your experience? and maybe in general, and then is there some sort of time frame within which that might be appropriate?
No, that tends to be a political question, and I think um, in the context of former Yugoslavia, we never got to that level of sort of policy or political maturity, largely because the country was unfortunately divided, and I blame Dayton Peace Accord, which was chaperoned by the United States, that in November of 1995 was signed, where essentially the genocide as a tool to gain territory was legitimized, which I think was a fundamental mistake of the international community, where Serbs, because they had the military, they had the power, the international community gave in and essentially gave the Serb leadership, this leadership that promoted genocidal ideas, half of the country. And divided Bosnia into an entity where whoever survived genocide amongst Muslims and Catholics and Jews lives in one side, and the other side is now called Serb Republic. It exists within Bosnia as one state, but it continues to have leadership among Serbs that deny genocide. And as you know, genocide denial is part of genocide. And so we as a country are not unified. Children in the Serb Republic do not learn about what was done in 1990s to Bosnian Muslims. And so I think it will be a long time before we talk about any kind of reparations in that context. But I don't think that it's ever too late to address those issues to the extent that it is possible.
Okay, here's a good question. Did you experience obstacles afterwards getting into the United States? Did you get assistance, and if so, from whom?
I won't share all the details. It was there was a lot of luck in my own, just in the act of survival. There are a number of times where I'm almost killed during the war, and on one occasion almost raped by a Serb soldier. But there was a moment where I, in besieged city of Bihac, meet two psychologists who came to evaluate the state of children and schools, and they asked me if I wanted to come to the United States, and I thought it was a joke because I was at the time certain that I would die. The question was whether I would die in a rape camp, concentration camp, or what I had hoped would happen, that I would be killed while asleep, while Serbs were bombing my city. And so I gave them all my documentation, and they came to the board meeting of the International Rescue Committee, an organization that they represented in Bosnia. The board meeting was happening in New York. And while they were talking about what they had seen, the kind of destruction and damage to children in Bosnia, one of the board members stood up and said, "Is there anyone that I can save?" And I was, at the time, I was in Bosnia growing up. I was one of the top students, and even during the war, I won math and physics competitions nationally. And so I gave them all these documents, including my own birth certificate, because I didn't think any of that mattered. I didn't think I would survive. This man who stood up, his name was David Pincus. He was a very close friend of Elie Wiesel, who wrote Night. David made it a mission to, his personal mission, to save me. And that's how I initially came to the United States.
That's very cool. There are a couple teachers, I think, in the audience, and they're wondering about how, well, if there is a companion teacher's guide workbook kind of thing in the works, I guess, for your book, and the best approach to use for teaching this, the most appropriate age group or grade group, and would you use excerpts? Is that an approach you would take? So I kind of put a bunch of questions together.
So I am sharing here for teachers. I would urge you to check voicesamplify.org, which is the website that I created with my students. Again, this is applying my experience, scholarship, this book, reading from this book, stories, details from my story, but also other stories, to give you some tools as teachers on how you can talk about these issues in the classroom, which I think is critically important. The cat I never named is appropriate for ages 12 and older. I intentionally made sure that the language and the manner in which I handled the topics in this book was done in a way that it would be digestible and appropriate in the classroom at that age. I will also, so I would suggest you either reach out to me or check out the website that I shared. Another website I'm sharing right now is, I believe, teachingbooks.com or .org. I'm not sure. I have created just some simple activities for that. Oh, sorry, I am actually sending a private message. I thought I sent a message to everyone, so I will resend that again. I have created a couple of simpler activities for teachingbooks.com or .org, where you can also check out some of the resources. But I would say what I had found is that most individuals who have reached out to me, who've read the book around the world, have, one, saw the connections with their current context. Two, they have fallen in love with characters and the prose, the language that I use to tell the story. This is not a book that's heavy on history or details. This is simply telling a story of a teenager who, by the way, also falls in love in the midst of the genocide, and who has this cat. Matzi is how we called her. Matzi came to us at the beginning of the war and ends up saving mine and my brother's life at the very beginning of the war. And so there are many characters through which young people can engage and relate to understand what happened in this context. And I would mention that also, that at the end of the book, I did think of educators, and I do include a couple of things. One, writing on and sharing my thoughts on the parallels between the current environment in the United States and what happened in Bosnia. And two, I also include the list of resources, so other websites that you can use, other visual representations of stories from Bosnia, so other movies or documentaries that might have been made that you can use in the classroom easily.
Are you comfortable telling us about the rest of your family and how they fared and where they are?
Not everyone survived. Not everyone is here today. I am lucky that some have, and I think I would say what is most notable in terms of the feedback I get from people, even from individuals who, for instance, send me emails, and this is probably the most frequent kind of email that I get from readers, and it goes something like this. Hi, Amra, I feel like I know you after reading your book, and I know your entire family, and I love these characters. And by the way, I knew nothing about Bosnia. I knew nothing about genocide. And I didn't think I was interested in nonfiction, but I liked the cover. I picked it up. and thought I would read a few pages, and it's 4 a.m. and I binge read the whole story. And so that is the most frequent kind of feedback that that I get. And that's in part because I did have a beautiful family. My parents were incredible human beings. I'll say that my mom is still with us. She lives with me, but our home was bombed on my birthday. It's a scene in the book. And my mom became deaf. She was also a teacher. And so my father was an orphan from World War II. His father was killed fighting Nazis. So there's a lot of pain and love in my family that is really intense and comes through in this story. And I think if you do choose to read it, you will fall in love with a number of characters.
Were you ever, did you ever find out the fate of the boy who you mentioned early on in the telling, the boy from the bridge?
Yes, he actually becomes my boyfriend during the war. And so that's a moment where there's a lot of scenes where this boy keeps reappearing in my life. And he becomes my first love because I was 16. I was this complete nerd before the war started, only focused on school. And then I realized, wow, I'm going to die and never kiss a boy. So maybe it's time to do that now. And so we fall in love, and it's part of the story.
I think today there is, in your hometown, there are immigrants who are there, refugees, I think, there, who are waiting to get into, I think through Croatia and then into the European Union, into Germany. How large is the group of Bosnians who are waiting to come here to the United States? Do you know about the process and the costs associated with that?
I think it's, as you can imagine, particularly in the last couple of years before, in the past administration, the anti-immigrant sentiment was very strong. I have to share that during the Trump administration, I was very nervous about my mother getting her citizenship, and we went through this initially very unpleasant experience, particularly, again, given the political context in which we were going through that over the last couple of years. So it is not easy to come to the United States. A lot of Bosnians instead have in recent years gone to, particularly to Austria and Germany. Bosnian Muslims tend to, I would say culturally, and of course I always try to be careful in making any stereotypes, but I think we knew generally that in former Yugoslavia, we couldn't succeed unless we either worked hard, or we couldn't be accepted unless we pursued education. So we tend to have a highly educated or skilled diaspora that works typically in Western European countries. And in the United States, we have, for instance, 60 or 70,000 Bosnians who came as refugees who live in St. Louis today. And there probably, I would estimate, 400,000 Bosnians who at some point have come, or are second generation already from the refugees that came during the war. But it's not easy. In terms of the migrants, how they're referred to, they're not referred to as refugees because giving someone a status of refugee implies certain legal obligations. So unfortunately, Europe refers to these people as migrants who are coming through Bosnia. And particularly in my hometown, if you remember from one of the maps, Bihac is on the border with Croatia. My house is only 5 minutes from crossing into Croatia. Croatia is now part of European Union. And so anyone who is escaping any other part of the world and wants to enter Europe without legal papers, they are trying. If they're refugees, and many refugees families have come to my hometown and they are trying to cross into Europe. In fact, after the pandemic, I plan on working on a project to capture some of those stories, because I've spoken to, before pandemic, I traveled to Bosnia and spoke to some of those migrants, and some of them have spent 4 years, 5 years trying to enter Europe to have a better life, and they can't find a legal way to do it. So it is very difficult to watch that, certainly for me as someone who has been able to build a better life in this country because someone decided to give me a chance.
Right. I know we're running close to the cutoff time. So if you have any other questions, if you want to filter them through pretty quickly, that'd be great. We do have one that's about something you mentioned about superiority. So for us at the Holocaust Museum, teaching about that concept from neo-Nazis, and white power, that kind of thing is an obvious one. You mentioned that the Serbs consider themselves superior. What was the basis for that? And knowing that there's a large group of people, like including in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge considered themselves superior to the Chinese and to the Vietnamese based on their skin color. So you have white groups whose skin color to them denotes superiority. You have Asian groups whose browner skin color denotes superiority. Where does that idea come from? And what would be the best approach for teaching that it's silly, for lack of a better term?
Mm-hmm. I always say that sometimes people meet me and number one, they say, how can you be Muslim? Because there is a stereotype of what a Muslim is, right? So because of that, they say, well, you can't be Muslim. And then there's often the question that follows that says, well, you couldn't have survived genocide. You look white, right? Because the assumption is that there has to be that physical demarcation in some way that people use wherever in the world to commit genocide. Well, in Bosnia, there was no differentiation in skin color, and the only differentiation really was this culturally embedded identity, either through language, through food, through religion, that one is Muslim. And I would say Muslim not a single religious group can be looked at through singular lens, because there are religious Jews and Jews who are not religious and Christians who go to church on Sunday and who don't. But when Muslims are talked about, the assumption is always that there is only one kind of a Muslim and we all kind of belong to that group. And so in Bosnia, that was not the case. There was a great deal of diversity, but there was that commonality of being Bosniak ethnically, culturally for centuries. And that was used to justify genocide. But to step back and address something that I think is even more important, why does it happen? Why do these narratives emerge? And I think they emerge because historically we know that people respond to the power of story. People respond to stories, which is one of the reasons that I chose to tell a story in order to get some of these more complex ideas into the classrooms and into the hands of teachers. And the purpose of the supremacy story, whoever is endorsing that kind of ideological framework, is to be able to dehumanize the other side. Because when you can dehumanize the other side, whoever the other is, when you can other them, then it becomes easier to commit violence. We, in fact, know from neuroscience research that humans can morally justify violence and want to be able to justify it so that they can feel good about themselves if they're in a position where they are deciding to commit violence. And so if you look at, for instance, some of the testimonies of Serb soldiers who executed women, children, men, civilians, not in fighting, just walked into homes and rounded them up and lined them up and killed them. Often they'll say, well, I did it in a clean way. We did it in an organized way. And I didn't get my hands dirty by burying those bodies. We actually had local villagers do that for us. So as a soldier, I did it in a manner that I think is appropriate. And so humans tend to find ways to justify violence when they want to engage in it for political, territorial reasons, and narratives that we tell, the narratives of supremacy, enable them to justify those acts, which is why I think it's important to not only counter that narrative, but actually build resilience to that kind of hateful narrative. And that is what I hope that The Cat I Never Named does, particularly with younger people.
You know, you mentioned denial and you mentioned dehumanization. Those are two of the, if you look at Dr. Stanton's 10 stages of genocide, those are kind of on the extreme. So that's interesting that you did that. Great answers, great questions from everybody out there. I'm not sure if Susan, if you wanted to wrap things up.
I just wanted to say thank you to Amra. This was so interesting. And I completely agree with your focusing on stories. That's what we do at the Holocaust Museum. When you can make something horrible like that personal rather than just facts and figures, but we now know, we know your story, we know our Holocaust survivors' stories, our locals. Renee Baduke is on this call, and there may be others that I didn't see. So that's really what can generate that compassion and empathy for these situations. And so congratulations on the great reception that your book has had, and I look forward to reading it. And thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and hope to see you all again soon.